She didn't look like a monster. That's what made her so dangerous. In the quiet, sterile halls of the hospital, where the first cries of life echoed like miracles, she moved with calm precision. A gentle smile. Soft footsteps. Reassuring words whispered to anxious parents clinging to hope. She was the nurse everyone trusted, the one you'd pray to have watching over your newborn when you couldn't. But behind that calm exterior, something was deeply wrong. Babies who were stable, healthy, even would suddenly crash. Breathing would stop without warning. Heart rates would plummet. Panic would erupt in the ward, alarms screaming into the night. Doctors fought desperately to save lives that had no reason to be slipping away. And yet, she was always there. At first, it felt like coincidence. Tragedy happens, they said. Hospitals are fragile places. But the pattern kept repeating. Too often. Too precisely. Too close to one person. Her presence became the last thing those babies would ever experience. No forced entry. No visible signs. Just a silent, calculated that blurred the line between caregiver and killer. It wasn't rage. It wasn't chaos. It was control. She wasn't just caring for life. She was deciding who got to keep it. Parents would leave their children in her hands, believing they were safe. They had no idea they were placing them in the care of someone who saw herself as something far more powerful than a nurse. Someone who believed she had the right to play God. And by the time anyone realized the truth, it was already too late. The hospital was known as a place of hope. A place where fragile lives were protected with the highest level of care, where trained professionals worked tirelessly to keep newborns safe through their most vulnerable moments. Parents walked through its doors carrying equal parts fear and excitement, trusting that their babies were in the best hands possible. And for a long time, nothing seemed out of place. She was one of the most reliable nurses on the ward. Calm under pressure, attentive to detail, and always present when things took a sudden turn. Colleagues admired her dedication. Doctors appreciated how quickly she responded during emergencies. To everyone around her, she appeared committed, almost too committed, to saving lives. But slowly, quietly, something began to shift. The neonatal unit, once stable and predictable, started experiencing an unusual number of critical incidents. Babies who were recovering suddenly deteriorated without clear medical explanation. Some stopped breathing. Others suffered unexplained cardiac arrests. The medical staff worked frantically each time, but there was a growing sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. At first, these incidents were treated as tragic coincidences. Hospitals deal with life and death situations every day, and sometimes outcomes can't be controlled. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern became harder to ignore. Many of these emergencies happened during the same shifts. And she was almost always there. Whispers began circulating among the staff. Nothing direct, just quiet observations, hesitant concerns, lingering questions no one was ready to say out loud. Could it really be possible? Someone so trusted, so calm, so professional, involved in something darker? The idea was unthinkable. Still, the numbers didn't lie. Some doctors started paying closer attention. They reviewed case notes, compared timelines, and looked for anything that could explain what was happening. But every time they searched for a clear medical cause, they came up empty. There was no infection, no equipment failure, no obvious mistake. Just a chilling pattern that pointed back to the same place. Back to her. Yet raising such an accusation wasn't simple. In a profession built on trust and teamwork, questioning a colleague, especially without concrete proof, could destroy reputations, careers, and lives. So for a while, the concerns stayed buried beneath professionalism and doubt. Meanwhile, the incidents continued. Parents remained unaware of the growing tension behind the scenes. They still saw her as a caring nurse, someone who held their babies gently and spoke with warmth and reassurance. They had no reason to suspect that beneath that composed exterior, a dangerous secret might be hiding. The ward carried on as usual on the surface. But underneath, suspicion was beginning to take root, and it was only a matter of time before it would demand answers. At first, the incidents were explained away with clinical language: complications, fragility, unpredictable outcomes. That's what hospitals do when something goes wrong. They search for answers within medicine, within science, within the limits of what can be explained. But what began as isolated tragedies slowly evolved into something far more disturbing. The pattern wasn't just unusual, it was impossible to ignore. Babies who were not only stable but improving would suddenly collapse without warning. Their oxygen levels would plummet. Their hearts would struggle, then stop. And each time, chaos would erupt in the neonatal unit: alarms blaring, doctors rushing in, desperate attempts to bring life back into tiny, fragile bodies. Some were saved. Many were not. And through it all, one constant remained: she was always there. It wasn't obvious at first. In a busy hospital, nurses rotate shifts, respond to emergencies, and move between patients constantly. But as the incidents increased, so did the unease. A few staff members began to notice something unsettling: not evidence, not proof, just a feeling that refused to go away. Why did these events seem to cluster around the same nurse? Why was she present during so many sudden deteriorations? And perhaps most chilling of all, why did she sometimes seem to arrive just moments before a baby's condition took a catastrophic turn? Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough. Accusing a healthcare professional of harm, especially in a place dedicated to saving lives, required more than instinct. It required undeniable evidence. And for a long time, that evidence simply didn't exist. Instead, there were only fragments: unanswered questions, uneasy glances, and a growing tension that lingered in the air of the ward. Meanwhile, she continued her work as if nothing was wrong. To the parents, she was still the perfect nurse. She spoke softly, offered reassurance, and handled their newborns with what appeared to be genuine care. In moments of fear, she was often the one standing beside them, explaining procedures, calming their panic. Some even felt grateful that she was present during emergencies, believing her quick responses were the reason their babies had a chance at survival. But behind that carefully constructed image, something darker was unfolding. Colleagues began quietly comparing notes. They reviewed shift schedules, patient charts, incident reports. Patterns emerged, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Certain types of collapses kept repeating. Unexpected air in bloodstreams. Unexplained drops in insulin levels. Situations that didn't align with the baby's medical conditions. And again, her presence appeared like a shadow across every case. Yet even as suspicion grew stronger, doubt held people back. What if they were wrong? What if this was just a tragic series of coincidences being misinterpreted? The consequences of a false accusation would be devastating, not just for her, but for the entire hospital. Reputations would be destroyed. Trust would be shattered. So instead of acting immediately, many chose silence, convincing themselves there had to be another explanation. But the incidents didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. Doctors who had once dismissed concerns started to feel the weight of uncertainty. Some requested internal reviews. Others quietly suggested that certain staff members be reassigned, hoping to see if the pattern would break. And for brief moments, it seemed like it might. There were periods of calm, days where no emergencies occurred, where the ward returned to its normal rhythm. But then, without warning, another baby would crash. And once again, she would be there. The tension reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Conversations that once happened in whispers began to take on a more serious tone. Senior staff were informed. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Data was analyzed more rigorously. And slowly, painfully, the unthinkable possibility started to take shape. What if this wasn't natural? What if someone inside the hospital, someone trusted, trained, and responsible for care, was deliberately causing harm? The idea was terrifying. Not just because of what it meant, but because of how long it had gone unnoticed. If it were true, it meant that the very place designed to protect life had become a hunting ground. That the system meant to safeguard the most vulnerable had failed them in the worst possible way. Still, moving from suspicion to action required courage, something not everyone was ready for. Some feared legal consequences. Others worried about being wrong. But as the number of victims grew, silence became harder to justify. The risk of doing nothing began to outweigh the fear of being mistaken. And then, something changed. A particularly troubling case caught the attention of senior consultants. The medical explanation didn't make sense again. But this time, instead of quietly accepting it, they pushed harder. They demanded deeper investigation, external review, and stricter oversight. The situation was no longer being treated as a series of unfortunate events. It was being treated as a potential crisis. Behind the scenes, the pressure was building. The nurse, however, remained composed. If she sensed the shift in atmosphere, she didn't show it. She continued her duties, interacted with colleagues, comforted parents, just as she always had. To an outside observer, nothing seemed different. But beneath the surface, the walls were slowly closing in. Because patterns, no matter how well hidden, have a way of revealing themselves. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. By the time the hospital began to fully grasp what might be happening, the damage had already been done. Lives had been lost. Families had been shattered. And the person they had trusted to protect those lives stood at the center of it all, surrounded by a growing storm of suspicion. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how far it had gone. And how many had already paid the price. For weeks, suspicion had been growing, but suspicion alone wasn't enough to shatter the illusion she had built so carefully. The hospital needed proof. Something undeniable. Something that would turn quiet doubt into a terrifying certainty. And then, it came. It started with a case that refused to make sense. A baby who had been stable, recovering, even improving, suddenly suffered a catastrophic collapse. The medical team responded immediately, doing everything they could, but the situation felt disturbingly familiar. The same unexplained symptoms. The same rapid deterioration. The same sense that something wasn't right. This time, however, the doctors didn't stop at saving the patient. They started watching more closely. Patient records were re-examined with intense scrutiny. Timelines were reconstructed down to the minute. Every detail, every note, every medication, every presence in the room was analyzed. And as the pieces began to fall into place, the pattern that once seemed like coincidence became something far more chilling. It wasn't random. It was precise. In case after case, the collapses occurred shortly after she had been alone with the babies. Not hours later. Not randomly during shifts. But within moments, minutes of her presence. The timing was too exact. Too consistent. Still, there was one question left. How? The answer, when it finally surfaced, was as horrifying as the pattern itself. Some babies had unexplained air in their bloodstream, something that should never happen naturally. Others showed signs of insulin spikes despite not being prescribed any. These weren't accidents. They weren't complications. They were deliberate, small, calculated actions that left almost no trace unless you knew exactly what to look for. And someone had known exactly what to do. The realization hit like a shockwave through the hospital. This wasn't just a series of tragic events. This was someone using their medical knowledge to quietly, systematically harm the most vulnerable patients imaginable. And all the evidence pointed to her. The nurse who had stood beside incubators during emergencies. The one who had comforted parents while their babies fought for life. The one who had built a reputation on calmness and care. She wasn't just present during the tragedies. She was at the center of them. When the hospital administration finally escalated the situation, bringing in external investigators, the atmosphere changed overnight. What had once been whispers turned into formal inquiries. Staff were questioned. Records were seized. Every shift she had worked was placed under a microscope. And even then, she didn't break. She continued to act as though nothing had changed. Calm. Professional. Unshaken. As if the storm building around her had nothing to do with her at all. But behind the scenes, the truth was closing in. Because once the pattern is seen, it can't be unseen. And now, for the first time, the hospital wasn't asking if something was wrong. They were asking how someone they trusted with life could be responsible for so much death. By the time the truth fully surfaced, the damage had already carved wounds that could never truly heal. What was once dismissed as tragic coincidence had transformed into something far more horrifying, something deliberate. Investigators had seen enough. The patterns, the timing, the medical anomalies, they all pointed in one direction. And when action was finally taken, it didn't come quietly. The day she was removed from the ward, the atmosphere inside the hospital shifted in a way no one could ignore. Whispers turned into silence. Faces once filled with routine focus were now heavy with disbelief. Some staff avoided eye contact altogether, as if acknowledging the truth would make it even more real. Parents who had once trusted her were now left questioning every moment. Every smile. Every reassurance. Every second their child had been in her care. For some, those questions would never be answered. For others, the answers came too late to change anything. Behind closed doors, the investigation deepened. Each case unraveled another layer of horror. Each file told a story that should have ended with life, but didn't. And at the center of it all was someone who had been given the ultimate responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. Instead, she had controlled their fate. The idea that someone could stand so close to life and choose to take it shattered something deeper than trust. It shook the very foundation of what a hospital is meant to be. A place of healing had, for a time, become something else entirely. Something no one ever expects. In the end, justice would begin its course. But justice doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't return lost lives. It doesn't silence the echoes of what those families endured. It only answers one question. Not how it happened, but who was responsible. And sometimes, that answer is the most terrifying part of all.